Morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Rachel Smith, and I am a representative of ASCHA, the Association of Scholars of Christianity in the History of Art. It's a real mouthful, which is why we have a nice, acronym, ASCHA, to remember. And Ron Bernier, who is my co-organizer of this particular day's events, this symposium, right here. So welcome to all of our speakers and some of the guests. We'll be having guests who are arriving and coming in and out throughout the day. As we get started in this kind of opening, roughly half hour, what we're wanting to do is, have a couple of welcomes by the co-sponsors, ASHA and the Center for World Christianity and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul that has partnered with us for this event. And then an introduction to the theme, which Ron will be doing, and then just go over a few of the logistics before we move into the sessions. But this is actually a theme that Ron and I have been thinking about individually and together for quite some time, and is obviously also really relevant. Any time it has perennial relevance, but also in our own time in some very distinctive ways. So before we get started, and I turn things over to Linda Stratford, I want to point out just a couple of special opportunities that we have today. So that when we get to the break, you're aware of those. So I want to introduce Monica Amparo. She's sitting over here behind this table. And she has a really special project that she developed that is, again, really relevant to this theme, where a few years ago she compiled a Catholic prayer book, a rosary book, that she illustrated with sacred art from all 7 continents. All 7 continents, so and not just Western Europe. And this was the first time where that kind of diversity, both of the art and the kind of representation, was included in this kind of text. And so it seemed like a really special thing to have that book available. So during the break, please stop by and talk with her. She has some examples of the book there. She also has a bookmark for each of you to, pick up as a little memento. So take advantage of that when you are in the various breaks that we've got. Her prayer book received the imprimatur from her local bishop in Arlington, Virginia, and it has been published, and so she can provide that information in terms of how to secure that as well. During the lunch break, we have the opportunity for a brief, roughly 30-minute tour. We have an hour and 15 minutes, so still time to eat in that period, of the St. Vincent de Paul Church, which is just, 2 doors over from this building. So it's very, very short. To see its stained glass as well as just really beautiful architecture, and where one of our speakers, our first speaker in the first session, Virginia, is going to give a little bit of an introduction and tour to those things, because she has written about the stained glass. So that's a special opportunity. So I'm going to turn things over to Linda Stratford here, who is the president of ASHA. So she's the president of the board of directors, just to give greetings and a little bit of information about ASHA. And one of the things that I do want to mention as I turn things over to her is that ASHA really values and has from its founding hospitality and welcome. It's one of those things that is front and center if you look at our purpose for being in everything that we do, from providing providing some refreshments, which DePaul was really generous in helping to support for that, but also generous dialogue and interaction as well. But I also want to, before turning things over to Linda, to remember, some of you probably saw in the news this morning that Reverend Jesse Jackson passed away in the last night, and it's been on the news. And so, again, remembering his legacy, especially here in Chicago, you know, for Chicagoans. A lot of things that are touchstones, so to speak, for the things that we're going to engage today. Linda?
Thank you, Rachel. We are a group that welcomes. That's an important word. When people look at our name, the Association of Scholars of Christianity in the History of Art, that raises so many questions. And one of the ways that we answer the question, am I welcome at ASCHA, is by being very clear that our work is as scholars to critically examine the relationship between Christianity and the visual arts. And so good words come out of that when we say critically examine, words like exchange of information, listening, as Rachel just pointed out, words like forums. And some of the three of you that I just saw that were with us at Columbia University this time last year, and others that go further back, you can imagine, and those of you who are with us for the first time today will experience what we mean by that. It is so rich to be in a nonpartisan ecumenical gathering, and yet to have an intensity in our subject. It's not an intensity in the case of ASCHA that comes from necessarily personal faith commitment. In the room, in other words, you're sitting next to people who are your neighbors. And yet, when we ask in our forum today, who is my neighbor, we're going to get different answers to that. And we bring this range of perspectives to all the work we do, our publications, our meetings, and that's what we're most proud of, I suppose, and celebrate. It's also what we're most afraid of. You can imagine. But what's so beautiful is, rather than, Jonathan Haidt talks about the hive mentality. Rather than become a buzzing hive of excitement over our knowledge that we're right, rather than do that, we enjoy hosting a different kind of buzz of excitement, a hive that's full of activity like this group will be, different perspectives, but importantly, listening to the perspectives of others, and I mean with a capital L, listening, and then critically examining as scholars what we've come up with. So thank you for being willing to be part of our ongoing experiment. No matter where you belong in the room, you are welcome. So we're glad you're here.
I now want to introduce Bill Kavanaugh, who is the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, another mouthful, of an organizational name, but where every word counts, in terms of how that's put together. Bill is really an esteemed theologian, and we are really delighted to partner with him. He told me when I reached out to him through a connection who is also in the room, Joel Carpenter, if you have a chance to meet him, that he had been wanting to do something related to the arts for a long time, but had not touched on the right partner or a partner that was really interested in doing that. And so we're delighted to have their partnership and their support, and where they are doing, again, really interesting work. So, Bill.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, when Rachel reached out about collaborating with this conference, I thought, yeah, this is a great opportunity to be neighborly. And what the center does is collaborate. We're always trying to kind of build bridges across cultures and continents and religions and so on. So the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology was founded in 2008 here at DePaul as a way of recognizing that the center of gravity of Christianity had shifted south. Beginning of the 20th century, 70% of Christians were in the north. Now, at the end of the century, they were 70% were in the south. So we host visiting scholars. We publish a book series and have a podcast series. We've had conferences on 3 different continents, in addition to here at DePaul, most recently in Ivory Coast in August. And it's an opportunity for DePaul, the center is an opportunity for DePaul to recognize its aspirations to be a university with a global reach, and also its Catholic identity, which is sometimes contested around here. Catholic, of course, meaning universal, but the Catholic Church really wasn't universal in a full sense until the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, 2 million Catholics in Africa. By the end, 170 million, and now it's 250 million, and so on. So people thought that the church would disappear once the colonial powers went home in the 1960s, but the opposite happened because it became an African thing, and that way people were attracted and grew, and so Africans are now missionaries to the north. And the power dynamics, which are so central to this question of welcoming the stranger, have really shifted in interesting ways. So the center is now collaborating on a project with the Vatican. It's this international cross-cultural training project to prepare missionaries and communities that receive them in welcoming the stranger. So this conference really dovetails well with our work, and obviously it's very timely given what's going on in the U.S. today, in an era where words have become weapons that we lob at each other all across these digital divides. It seems to me that art has a promise to kind of move us when the discourse has gotten entrenched and barren. And so I'm really excited about this. I teach a class actually on immigrant Catholicism in Chicago, where we go out into the city, and Marlon is my collaborator on this. We take a class out into the city, and we go to a Polish Catholic church and a Chinese Catholic church and Mexican, Ukrainian, Vietnamese, and so on. And it's called Global Catholicism in Story and Stone. And the stone part is what is most, I think, moving about it. It's the most effective thing I do as a teacher, I think, is just to bring students out to see the dragons in the altar at the Chinese church, and to see the riot of Polish Baroque and the Book of Kells, the way it's influenced old St. Pat's. And it really kind of realizes, the Japanese Catholic novelist Shusaku Endo talks about Christianity as a symphony, where every people and all around the world is needed to play a particular instrument or a particular note. And I think that really comes across in the art that we see. And I'm really delighted that the theme of the Good Samaritan is the theme of this conference as well. The powerful reflection of Ivan Illich on the Good Samaritan parable, I think, is really close to my heart. According to the Greek text, the Samaritan is moved in his bowels by the sight of the beaten Jew, and he's not convinced by ethical precepts or words, but by the visual icon of suffering. Illich calls it flesh calling out to flesh. And I think we often read this parable as the universalization of ethics. You know, we would go from concern to for the neighbor to the concern for everybody. But Illich says that the neighbor isn't everybody, the neighbor is anybody. I think that's a wonderful distinction. It's not everybody, it's anybody that contingency or providence throws into your path. And so it's about, rather than these kind of universal ethical rules, it's about particulars. It's about the attention to the person that has been thrown in front of you by God in all of their messy, concrete reality. And it seems to me that that's what art does. It calls our attention to the particular, its materiality, its flesh calling out to flesh. So I'm really looking forward to spending at least part of the day with you, and a warm welcome from DePaul.
We were especially excited to host this particular theme here in Chicago, because there's so many organizations and entities, you know, that are doing significant and interesting work, you know, in relation to a diversity of outworkings of these particular issues. So it seemed like absolutely the right place to take up this particular topic. So I want to introduce then, again, a little bit more formally, my co-organizer and good friend and colleague, Ron Bernier, who teaches at the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, but he has done many things, including working for several other academic and esteemed academic institutions over the years, as well as in the gallery and museum context. He has degrees in art history, but also in theology and also in business. So he is a true kind of Renaissance man, you know, who can move in many different ways. And he and I have partnered on many events, as well as publications, significant book publications and book length publications. And so he's going to talk a little bit about this theme, because he is really the person who is primarily responsible for the really wonderful call for papers and kind of description of this theme. He's a beautiful writer, a really lyrical and thoughtful writer, but having him frame this for us seemed especially appropriate. So, Ron.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome, everyone. I know we're all anxious to get to these great papers, so I won't take up much more of our time, but I did want to talk a little bit about how this symposium came to be. As most of you know, and as Rachel just indicated, we have a related session on the same theme at CAA, College Art Association, on Saturday this week. And when last year at this time, when we were at CAA in New York, we were thinking about what the theme for this year would be, and the theme of neighborliness and refuge came up for obvious reasons. We were only a month into then the current regime, and the need for this kind of conversation obviously has just intensified over the last year. So I just thought it would be useful to sort of set the parameters a little bit about the parable that we're sort of hooking our papers onto today, or thinking onto today. And the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke endures as a powerful symbol, a powerful meditation on compassion, hospitality, and the boundaries of moral responsibility. And in an age marked by geopolitical instability, mass displacement, and deepening social divides, think Minneapolis, the question, and who is my neighbor, requires renewed urgency. Now, the parable is often heard as a moral fable about kindness. But in the work of John Dominic Crossan, a renowned historical Jesus scholar associated with the Jesus Seminar and former DePaul professor, the parable becomes something far more unsettling. A narrative that destabilizes who counts as moral and who bears ethical authority. Crossan's approach reads the Jesus parables, as he refers to them, the Jesus parables in particular, as subversive narratives meant to destabilize social and religious expectations, not merely to illustrate moral principles. So for Crossan, parables are provocative events, not simple ethical lessons. They often invert dominant social hierarchies, and they function as challenges. He refers to these as the challenge parables, challenges to systems of purity, exclusion, and power. So the Good Samaritan becomes less, I think, a lesson about kindness and more a radical critique of social boundaries and the interruption of our habits of seeing. Now, in Luke's account, a wounded man lies in the road, a priest passes, a Levite passes. Both figures are religious legitimacy, figures of religious legitimacy and institutional order. But then comes the Samaritan. And for Crossan, this choice is the shock of the parable. Samaritans were not simply different. They were religiously suspect, ethnically othered, and socially distrusted. Jesus deliberately cast the wrong person as the ethical agent. So the Samaritan doesn't ask, who is my neighbor? He answers a different question entirely. How does one become a neighbor? Neighborliness in Crossan's reading is not an identity. It's an action that crosses boundaries. Ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries, bodily boundaries. The Samaritan risks contamination, danger, economic loss. So compassion here is costly, and it's embodied and sustained. The parable therefore reverses expectations. The moral exemplar is the socially stigmatized figure. Again, Jesus deliberately casts the wrong person as the ethical agent. In Crossan's words, the neighbor is not someone you predefine, it is someone you become through action. It is enacted compassion. And notice that not everyone in the story, everyone in the story does see the wounded body. So the difference is not perception, it's response. What matters is not that others pass by, but that they see and do not respond. Crossan implicitly reframes the parable as a lesson in ethical perception. Again, seeing suffering, interpreting obligation, and acting despite social codes. And this becomes crucial for modern visual culture. The parable asks, what does it mean to see another person as having a claim on us? We advance from parable to contemporary art. In the work of Ai Weiwei, for instance, his Law of the Journey, giving refugees visibility. The Law of the Journey installation includes life vest installations, documentary projects, forcing viewers, in other words, into the position of the passerby. Like the Samaritan parable, these works ask, will you look? Will you cross distance? Will you respond beyond sentiment? The refugee becomes the contemporary Samaritan figure, politically othered, morally demanding, and impossible to ignore without ethical consequence. Dora Salcedo's work makes injury architectural. Her installation, Shibboleth, literally cracked the museum floor, evoking migration, exclusion, and historical trauma. Here, the wounded body becomes spatial. It's impossible to step over comfortably, also impossible to ignore. And this parallels Crossan's reading. Neighborliness is not comforting. It's unavoidable. Neighborliness begins when distance collapses. Or in the work of Theaster Gates, where neighborliness is seen as ongoing care. His Dorchester projects transform abandoned buildings into cultural and community resources. And again, this is not a single compassionate act, it's sustained neighborliness. There's investment, economic investment, stewardship, sustained care, and long-term presence, that is commitment. If the Samaritan paid the innkeeper for future care, Gates institutionalizes that model. So finally, for Crossan, the Good Samaritan parable, again, doesn't simply teach kindness. And I think that's the important lesson here. It challenges us. It forces us to consider things that we are probably uncomfortable considering. It challenges social boundaries, religious hierarchies, and patterns of seeing and ignoring. And contemporary artists continue this work visually, asking us, who remains unseen? Who counts as a neighbor? And what responsibilities follow from looking? Neighborliness is not declared, it is practiced, often at risk and often across differences. And both theology and contemporary art remind us, I think, that ethical seeing is never neutral. So with that, I think I give it back to Rachel for further introduction.
Just a couple of other examples to sort of prime the pump, so to speak, of the movement through the day. So some of you are probably familiar with the John Nava tapestries in the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels, that were commissioned and represent, again, the saints across the history of the church, but in the guise of contemporary friends, essentially, of John Navas from the Los Angeles diocese, one of the most diverse dioceses that, exists in the world, which again is just a really interesting example to look at within the church. My own interest in the project, as I mentioned, has been long-standing, goes way back to about 2008, and you'll see that neighbors, strangers, family, friends, charis, boundary crossings, thinking about this in a broad context, and where it brings to mind things like the boundary crossings within a nation like China, Shubing's Phoenix, where he is representing the migration of people from the countryside, illegal migration for a very long time into the cities that you have, and using the detritus basically of the industrial sites and the construction sites as they are the anonymous workers in the cities building the new China, and the way in which context informs the thinking about these phoenixes rising from the ashes, where we see the one installation in Mass Mocha that has its own very interesting history with migration in Chinese communities in the past. And then in St. John the Divine, again, that sort of poses different questions when you see it in that context. Another project, just to give a sense of the scope of the way that artists are dealing with these issues, another work by Ai Weiwei called Laundromat, that again is a collection of the clothing that was abandoned in a refugee camp and then put out, laundered and pressed, and the way in which the kind of palpable presence of the people is really there because there is no reason for shoes or for shirts or for clothing if there's not a person who needs to wear them, and the way in which that really becomes very, very poignant when you see all of the little children in the onesies, that were found just abandoned, giving a sense of the scope and the global scope of these issues. Another work that very recent, an installation in the old church in Amsterdam, representing the roughly 120 different ethnic communities that are represented there historically and into the present, and using both the Yiddish, because of the history of Amsterdam being a kind of safe haven for Jews at a certain point in the history, but where the artist Kim Soo is using the Korean botari, the textile bundles, and using textiles from these different groups. And again, the way that the space, the sacred space of installing these things poses really quite amazing, questions about our obligations, so to speak, on many different levels. Another interesting example closer to home here in the United States, in Baltimore, the Govans Presbyterian Church, where they recently commissioned a work to flank the historic stained glass. Again, a stained glass, the historic one, representing the theme of the consoling Christ, and then feeling like they needed to really bring that into the contemporary moment. And so commissioning a Baltimore artist, an African-American artist, to paint the panels on the sides to, again, bridge time and all of the kind of movement of peoples across time through a particular city, a particular place. And then I wanted to end before we get going here with just bringing us back, since we're here at DePaul, with Timothy Schmaltz's Angels Unawares sculpture, one of the casts of that was installed in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City in front of St. Peter's to commemorate the World Day of Migrants and Refugees in 2019. And the way that this brought to mind, I was talking with someone just earlier, this kind of bridging of history that we have, and the way in which many contemporary artists are echoing things from the past. And it, the theme, the title of this contemporary sculpture, representing all of these migrations of peoples that have been occurring in more recent history, calls us back to Andrei Rublev's really famous icon of the Trinity from the 15th century, that is known as the Hospitality of Abram, but where if you go back to the text, it says, "Be careful, you may be entertaining angels unaware that they are angels," when you are entertaining the stranger. And that this seemed to be an especially kind of apt remembrance here.